Metro 2033, Dmitry Glukhovsky, Chapter 13, The Great Library. Artyom went out into the station, looking from side to side with a mad look in his eye. He had just entered into one of the strangest agreements of his life. His employers refused to even explain what exactly he was supposed to find in the Stack archives, promising to provide him with details later after he had already gone up to the surface. And though it had occurred to him for a moment that they were talking about the book Daniel had told him about the night before, he didn't dare ask the Brahmins about it. Then, too, both of them had been pretty drunk yesterday when his hospitable host had told him this secret, so there was reason to doubt its truth. He would not be going to the surface alone. The Brahmins intended to outfit an entire detachment. Artyom was to go up with at least 2 stalkers and 1 person from the caste to whom he was to immediately give what had been found, should the expedition meet with success. That same person would show Artyom something that would help eliminate the threat hanging over VDNKH. Now, having emerged from the impenetrable gloom of the room onto the platform, the terms of the agreement seemed absurd to Artyom. As in the old fairy tale, he was required to go he knew not where, to fetch he knew not what, and in exchange he was promised he knew not what kind of miraculous salvation. But what else could he do? Return with empty hands? Is that what the hunter expected of him? When Artyom had asked his mysterious employers how he would find what they were looking for in the giant stacks of the library, he was told that he would understand everything in due course. He would hear. He did not ask any more questions, fearful that the Brahmins would lose their confidence in his extraordinary abilities, in which he himself did not believe. Finally, he was strictly warned that the soldiers must not learn anything, else the agreement would no longer be in force. Artyom sat down on a bench in the center of the hall and started to think. This was an incredible chance to go out onto the surface, do what he had only done once before, and do it without fear of punishment or consequences. To go up on the surface, and not alone, but with real stalkers, to carry out a secret mission for the Guardian caste. He hadn't even asked them why they so detested the word librarian. Melnick slumped down on the bench next to him. Now he looked tired and overwrought. "Why'd you say yes?" he asked, without expression and looking in front of him. "How'd you find out?" asked Artyom, surprised. Less than a quarter hour had passed since his conversation with the Brahmins. "I'll have to go with you," continued Melnick in a dull voice, ignoring the question. "I answer to Hunter for you now, whatever's happened to him. And there's no backing out on an agreement with the Brahmins. Nobody's done it yet. And above all, don't think about blabbing to the military." He got up, shook his head, and added, "If you only knew what you're getting into. I'm going to sleep. We'll be getting up tonight." "But aren't you in the military?" asked Artyom, catching up to him. "I heard them call you colonel." "Yeah, I'm a colonel, just not in their chain of command," answered Melnick grudgingly, and left. Artyom spent the rest of the day learning about polis, walking about aimlessly through the limitless space of stairs and passages, examining the majestic colonnades, and marveling at how many people this underground city could accommodate. He studied the whole of the Metro News penny sheet, which was printed on brown wrapping paper, listened to vagrant musicians, leafed through books at stalls, played with puppies that were being offered for sale, listened to the latest gossip, and could not shake the feeling that he was being followed all this time and was under constant observation. Several times he even wheeled around suddenly, hoping to catch someone's attentive look, but it was no use. He was surrounded by a swarming crowd, and nobody paid any attention to him. Finding a hotel in one of the passages, he slept for several hours before appearing at 10 in the evening, as had been agreed at the gate of the exit into the city at Borovitskaya. Melnick was running late, but the sentries had been informed and offered Artyom a cup of tea while he waited. Interrupting himself for a minute to pour boiling water into an enameled cup, the elderly sentry continued his story. "So,
I was assigned to listen to the radio. Everyone hoped to catch a transmission from government bunkers beyond the Urals. But it was no use because the first thing they hit was the strategic targets. That's how Ramenki got smeared. And all of the out-of-town summer residences with their basements 30 meters deep, how they got smeared too.
They might have even spared Ramenki. They didn't try too hard to hit the peaceful population. Nobody knew then that this war was to the very end. So maybe they might have spared Ramenki, but there was a command point right next to it, so they slammed it. And as far as civilian casualties were concerned, it was all, as they say, collateral damage. You should pardon the expression. But at that time, nobody believed that yet. So the brass had me sit and listen to the airwaves over next to Arbatskaya in a bunker. And initially, I heard a lot of strange stuff. Siberia was quiet, though other parts of the country were broadcasting. Submarines, strategic, nuclear, went on the air. They'd ask whether to strike or not. People didn't believe that Moscow no longer existed. Full captains were sobbing like kids over the radio. It's strange, you know, when salty naval officers who hadn't uttered a swear word in their entire lives are crying and asking for someone to check and see if their wives or daughters are among the survivors. Go look for them here, they'd say. And later, they'd all react differently. There were those who said, that's it, the hell with it, it's an eye for an eye. And they'd get in close to their shores and launch everything against the cities. Others, on the contrary, decided that since everything was already going to hell in a handbasket, there wasn't any sense in continuing to fight. Why kill more people? But that didn't have any effect. There were enough out there who wanted to avenge their families, and the boats answered for a long time. They could run underwater for half a year while on station. They found some of them, of course, but they couldn't find all of them. Well, that's an earful of history. To this day, when I think about it, I get the shakes, but that wasn't the point. I once picked up a tank crew that miraculously survived a strike. They were ferrying their tank from their unit or something. It was a new generation of armor technology that protected them from the radiation. So here were these three guys in this tank, and they light out at full speed from Moscow, headed east. They drove through some burning villages, picked up some broads, and went on, stopping to top off with some straw distillator, and then getting back on the road. When the fuel finally ran out, they were in some backwater where there wasn't anything left to bomb. The background radiation there, too, remained pretty high, of course, but still it was nothing like it was next to the cities. They laid out a camp, dug their tank in hull down, and ended up with a sort of fortification. They pitched tents nearby, eventually built mud huts, set up a manual generator for electricity, and lived for a fairly long time around that tank. For 2 years, I spoke to them almost every night and knew all of what was going on in their personal lives. Everything was quiet at first. They set up a farmstead, and 2 of them had kids that were almost normal. They had enough ammo. They saw some weird stuff there, and creatures were coming out of the forest, the likes of which the lieutenant we were talking to couldn't even describe properly. Then they went off the air. I spent another half year trying to raise them, but something happened out there. Maybe their generator or transmitter broke down, or maybe they ran out of ammo. You were talking about Ramenki, recalled his partner. About how it got bombed, and I thought, for as long as I've been serving here, nobody can tell me anything about the Kremlin. How is it that it remained whole? Why didn't it get hit? I mean, that's where you expect to find right proper bunkers. Who told you it didn't get hit? Man, did it get hit, the sentry assured him. They just didn't want to demolish it because it's an architectural monument, and also because they were testing new weapons against it. So that's what we got. It would have been better if they'd wiped it off the earth from the beginning. He spat and fell silent. Artyom sat quietly, trying not to distract the veteran from his reminiscences. It was rare that he was able to hear so many details of how everything had come about, but the elderly sentry remained quiet, lost in some private thought, and eventually Artyom seized the moment and decided to ask a question that had preoccupied him earlier, too. But there's subway systems in other cities, aren't there? At least I heard there were. Is it true there's no people left anywhere?
When you were a radio operator, didn't you hear any signals? No, I didn't hear anything, but you're right. People in Petersburg, for example, should have been able to save themselves. Their subway stations are deeply embedded, some even deeper than what we've got here, and the setup was the same. I traveled there when I was young, I remember. On one line, they had no exits onto the tracks. Instead, they had these hefty iron portals. When the train arrived, the portal doors would open together with the doors of the train. I remember this, quite me, surprised at the time. I asked everyone, but nobody could properly explain why things were set up that way. One told me it was to prevent flooding. Another told me it saved a heap of money on finishing work. Later, I became friends with this one subway worker, and he told me that something had devoured half of one construction team, and that the same was going on with other teams. They were finding only the gnawed bones and the tools. Of course, the public was never told anything, but those iron doors were installed all along the line, just to be on the safe side. And that was, let me think, back when... Anyway, what the radiation may have spawned there is hard to imagine. The conversation broke off as Melnick and one other person, short and thick-set, with deeply set eyes and a massive jaw overgrown by a short beard, came up to the gate. Both were already wearing their protective suits and had large haversacks slung on their backs. Melnick silently inspected Artyom, placed a large black bag next to Artyom's feet, and motioned towards the army tent. Artyom slipped inside and, opening the zipper on the bag, took out a black set of overalls like the ones Melnick and his partner wore, an unusual gas mask, with a full-face window and 2 filters on the sides, high-laced boots, and most important, a new Kalashnikov assault rifle with a laser sight and folding metal stock. It was an exceptional weapon. The only thing Artyom had seen like it had been carried by the elite Hansa units who patrolled the line in rail motor cars. A long flashlight and round helmet with a fabric cover lay at the bottom of the bag. He hadn't had the time to finish dressing when the tent flap lifted and the Brahmin Daniel entered. In his hands, he held an identical zippered stretch bag. They stared at each other in amazement. Artyom was the first to realize what was what. You're going up. You're our chaperone. You're going to help us go look for... I don't know what, he asked jeeringly. I know what it is, snarled Daniel, but I have no idea how you intend to look for it. Neither do I, admitted Artyom. I was told it to be explained later. So, here I am waiting. And I was told that a clairvoyant is being sent up to the surface, and that he's supposed to feel where to go. I am the clairvoyant, snorted Artyom. The elders believe that you have a gift, and that your destiny is special. Somewhere in the Testament is a prophecy foretelling the appearance of a youth led by fate, who will find the hidden secrets of the great library. He will find that which our caste has attempted to find for this past decade without success. The elders are convinced that this person is you. Is it that book you told me about? Asked Artyom. For a long time, Daniel didn't answer, then he nodded his head. You're supposed to feel it. It's not hidden from everyone. If you're really that same youth led by fate, then you won't even have to run around the Stack archives. The book will find you, he said, running his eyes over Artyom searchingly, and then added, What did you ask from them in exchange? There was no use keeping back the truth. Artyom was only unpleasantly surprised that Daniel, who was supposed to give him information capable of saving VDNKH from the ghoul invasion, knew nothing of this danger or of the conditions of his agreement with the council members. He briefly summarized the agreement for Daniel and explained the catastrophe he was trying to prevent. Daniel attentively heard him out and was still standing motionless and thinking about something when Artyom left the tent. Melnick and the bearded stalker were already waiting in full combat dress, holding their gas masks and helmets in their hands. His partner now carried the light machine gun, while Melnick clasped a copy of the assault rifle that Artyom had been given. A night vision device was hanging around his neck. When Daniel stepped out of the tent, he and Artyom looked at each other with a swagger. Then Daniel gave a wink and both started to laugh. They both now looked like real stalkers. We lucked out. Before rookies go on important missions, they spend 2 years training under stalkers, fetching firewood from the surface. But you and I,
We were sitting pretty, said Daniel, whispering to Artyom. Melnik looked at them disapprovingly, but said nothing. He motioned for them to follow. They came up to the passage arch, and after going up the stairs, stopped at the next cement block wall, where there was an armored door guarded by a reinforced sentry detail. The stalker greeted the sentries and gave the sign to open the door. One of the soldiers got up from his seat, went to the door, and pulled at the bolt heavily. The thick steel door moved smoothly to the side. Melnik let the other three pass, saluted the sentries, and went out last. A short buffer zone about 3 meters in length began beyond the door, between the wall and the pressure doors. Another 2 heavily armed soldiers and an officer stood watch there. Before giving the order to raise the iron barrier, Melnik decided to brief the rookies.
Listen up, no talking en route. Either of you ever been on the surface? Never mind, give me the map, he said to the officer. Until we get to the vestibule, walk in my footsteps and don't wander. Don't look around, don't talk. When we leave the vestibule, don't even think about going through the turnstiles or you'll lose your legs. Keep following me. I don't want to see any independent activity. Then I'll go outside. 10 over there. He pointed at the bearded stalker. It will stay behind and cover the station vestibule. If everything is clear, then as soon as we're on the street, we'll immediately turn left. It's not too dark right now, so don't use your flashlights out there. We don't want to attract attention. Did you get the word about the Kremlin? It'll be on the right. But one tower can be seen above the buildings as soon as you come out of that metro. Don't look at the Kremlin, no matter what. I'll personally smack anyone who does upside their head. So it's true about the Kremlin and about the stalker's rule not to look at it, no matter what, thought Artyom in amazement. Suddenly something stirred within him, some fragmented thoughts and images, stirred and then calmed down. We're going up to the library. We'll go as far as the doors and steps. I'll go in first. If the stairs are clear, 10 will keep his sights on him, and we'll go up. Then we'll cover 10, and he'll come up. No talking on the stairs. If you spot danger, signal with your flashlight. Don't shoot unless it's absolutely necessary. Shots can attract them. Who? Artyom could not stay quiet. What do you mean, who? Repeated Melnik. Who would you expect to meet in the library? Librarians, of course. Daniel swallowed hard and paled. Artyom looked at him, then at Melnik, and decided this was no time to pretend he was a know-it-all. And who's that? Melnik raised his eyebrows in surprise. His bearded partner put a hand over his eyes. Daniel looked at the floor. For a long time, the stalker looked at Artyom with eyebrows raised, and when he finally understood that Artyom wasn't joking, he coolly answered, "You'll see for yourself." The main thing to remember is this. You can keep them from attacking if you look them straight in the eyes. Straight in the eyes. Got it? Don't let them get behind you. That's all. Move out. He put on his gas mask, then his helmet, and gave the sentries the thumbs up. The officer took a step to the master switch and opened the pressure doors. The steel barrier crawled upward, slowly. The show had begun. Melnik waved his hand, indicating it was okay to come out. Artyom pushed the transparent door, raised his rifle, and jumped out into the street. And although the stalker had demanded that he follow in his footsteps and not wander, it wasn't possible to obey. The sky had changed completely since that time when Artyom had seen it as a boy. Instead of a limitless, transparent sky-blue space, dense gray clouds now hung low overhead, and the first drops of an autumn rain had begun to ooze from this cotton-like sky. A cold wind blew in gusts, and Artyom felt it even through the cloth of his protective suit. There was a mind-boggling, inconceivable amount of space here, to the right and to the left and in front. This boundless space was both spellbinding and strangely depressing at the same time. For a fraction of a second, Artyom wanted to return to the Borovitskaya vestibule, underground, and feel protected by the nearby walls and immerse himself in the comfort of an enclosed, limited space. He was able to deal with this oppressive feeling only by forcibly distracting himself to study the nearest buildings. The sun had already set, and the city was gradually descending into a dingy twilight.
The skeletons of low apartment houses, dilapidated and pitted by decades of acid rainstorms, stared at the travelers with empty orbits of broken windows. The city. It was a dismal yet magnificent sight. Hearing no calls, Artyom stood still, looking about as if mesmerized. He could finally compare reality with his dreams and with nearly equally blurry childhood memories. Daniel, who likely also had never been on the surface, froze next to him too. The last to emerge from the station vestibule was 10. The stalker slapped Artyom on the shoulder to get his attention and pointed to the right to where, in the distance, the silhouette of the cathedral's dome stood out against the sky. "Look at the cross," droned the 10's voice through the gas mask's filters. At first, Artyom noticed nothing in particular and didn't actually see the cross. Only when a giant winged shadow took flight from the crossbar with a lingering, blood-curdling wail did he understand what 10 had meant. After a few flaps of its wings, the monster had gained altitude and began to glide downward in wide circles, searching for prey. "That's where they nest," said 10 with a wave of the hand. Staying close to the wall, they moved to the entrance of the library. Melnick led the group, staying several steps ahead, while 10 was stepping backward, half-turned, covering the rear. It was precisely because both stalkers were distracted that Artyom was able, even before they had drawn even with the statue of the old man sitting in the armchair, to cast a glance at the Kremlin. Artyom had not intended to do it, but when he saw the monument, it was as if he had been jolted, and something cleared up in his mind. A whole piece of yesterday's dream suddenly popped to the surface. But now, it didn't seem to be only a dream, because the panorama and library colonnade that he had seen exactly resembled the view that was before him now. Did that mean that the Kremlin looked the same as he had imagined in his visions? Nobody was looking at Artyom. Even Daniel wasn't nearby, as he tarried behind with 10. "It was now or never," said Artyom to himself. His mouth became dry, and blood began to pound in his temples. The star on the tower really did glitter. "Hey, Artyom! Artyom!" Someone shook his shoulder. A numb awareness came alive with difficulty. A bright flashlight beam assaulted his eyes. Artyom started to blink his eyes and shaded them with his hand. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the granite base of the monument. Daniel and Melnick were bending over him. Both were looking into his eyes with worry. "His pupils are constricted," stated Melnick. "How'd you manage to lose him?" he asked 10 with annoyance. The latter stood at some distance and kept his eyes on the street. "Something made a noise back there, and I couldn't turn my back to it," explained the stalker. "Who could guess he was so quick? Look, he almost made it to the manege within a minute. And he would have kept going. It's a good thing our Brahmin has a head on his shoulders," he said, and slapped Daniel on the back. "It shines," said Artyom to Melnick in a weak voice. "It shines," he said, looking at Daniel. "It shines. Okay, it shines," repeated Daniel reassuringly. "Weren't you told not to look over there, dumbass?" said Melnick to Artyom angrily, now convinced the danger had passed. "You going to obey your superiors?" he asked, and cuffed him on the back of his head. The helmet reduced the educational value of the blow, and Artyom continued to sit on the ground, batting his eyes. Having finally run out of obscenities, the stalker grabbed him by the shoulders, shook him hard, and put him on his feet. Artyom gradually recovered himself. He grew ashamed that he was not able to resist temptation. He stood, looking down at the toes of his boots, hesitating to look at Melnick. Luckily, Melnick didn't have time to read any sermons, as he had been distracted by 10, who was standing in the intersection. He had signaled his partner to join him and was pressing his finger to a filter on his gas mask, indicating a need for silence. Artyom decided to stay out of trouble by now following Melnick everywhere and never to turn in the direction of the enigmatic towers. Approaching 10, Melnick also froze in his tracks. The bearded man was pointing into the distance, away from the Kremlin, to where the long, crumbling high-rises along Kalinin Prospect gave the appearance of grinning, rotten teeth. Carefully drawing near to them, Artyom looked out from behind the stalker's broad shoulders and immediately understood the situation.
Right in the middle of the prospect, about 60 meters from them, he saw 3 human silhouettes standing motionless in the gathering dusk. Human. At such a distance, Artyom wouldn't have bet they were indeed people, but they were of medium height and stood on 2 legs. This was encouraging. "Who's that?" Artyom asked hoarsely, whispering, while trying to identify the distant figures through the fogged window of his gas mask. Were they people or some spawn that he had heard spoken of? Melnick silently shook his head, making it known that he didn't know any more than Artyom. He shone the beam of his flashlight at the motionless beings and made 3 circular motions. Then he switched his flashlight off. In answer, a bright spot of light came on in the distance, moved in a circle 3 times, and went out. Tension eased immediately, and the electrified atmosphere returned to normal. Artyom sensed this even before Melnick gave the all-clear. "Stalkers," explained the guide. "Remember, for next time, 3 circles with a flashlight is our recognition signal. If you get the same response, you can go forward without fear. You won't come to harm. If you get no response or some other response, then run. Don't wait. But if they have a flashlight, it means they're human and not some kind of monsters from the surface," objected Artyom. "I don't know what's worse," said Melnick, cutting off Artyom. Without further explanation, he moved up the stairs to the library entrance. The heavy oak door, almost as tall as 2 people, gave slowly, almost unwillingly. The door's rusted hinges shrieked hysterically. Melnick slipped inside, put his night vision unit to his eyes while holding his rifle level with one arm. After a second, he signaled the others to follow. They could see a long corridor before them, with the twisted framework of iron coat racks along the sides. This was once a cloakroom. In the distance, in the fading day's light coming weakly in from the street, were the white marble steps of a wide, rising staircase. The ceiling was about 15 meters high, and the wrought railing of the second-floor gallery could be distinguished about halfway up the wall. There was a brittle silence in the hall, responding to their every step. The walls of the vestibule were covered by moss that stirred slightly, as if it were breathing, and strange vine-like plants as thick as one's arm hung from the ceiling almost to the floor. Their stalks shimmered with a greasy luster in the flashlight beams and were covered with large malformed flowers that exuded a suffocating odor that made one's head spin. They also swayed ever so slightly, and Artyom didn't feel like venturing to find out if the wind blowing through the broken second-floor windows caused them to move, or whether they moved on their own. "What's this?" asked Artyom, addressing 10 and touching the vine with his hand. "Greenery," came the filtered reply. "House plants after being irradiated, that's what. Morning glories. Did a proper job of growing 'em, those botanists." Following Melnick, they reached the stairs and started to ascend, keeping to the left wall while 10 covered them. The lead stalker did not take his eyes off the black square of the entrance to other rooms that could be seen ahead of them. The others ran their flashlight beams over the marble walls and the rusty, moss-pitted ceiling. The wide marble stairs on which they stood led to the second floor of the vestibule. There was no ceiling above it, and thus both vestibule floors combined into a single huge space. The vestibule's second level formed 3 sides of a rectangle. In the center there was a space through which the stairs ascended, and there were areas along the edges with wooden cabinets. Most of them had either burned or rotted, but some looked as if people had used them just the day before. There were hundreds of small drawers in each section. "The card catalog," said Daniel quietly, looking around with reverence. "The future can be foretold using these drawers. The initiated know how. After a ritual, you blindly pick one of the cabinets, then randomly pull out a drawer and take any card. If the ritual is properly performed, then the name of the book will foretell your future, provide a warning, or predict success." For a second, Artyom wanted to go up to the nearest cabinet and find out what section of the card catalog the fates had brought him to. But his attention was distracted by a giant cobweb which stretched several meters across a broken window in a far corner. A bird of considerable size was caught in thin filaments of apparently extraordinary strength. It was still alive, twitching weakly. To his relief,
Artyom did not see whatever it was that had managed to spin this unnatural web. Besides them, there wasn't a soul in the vast vestibule. Melnick signaled them all to stop. "Now listen," he said to Artyom. "Don't listen to what's outside. Try to hear the sounds from inside you in your head. The book is supposed to call you. The Brahmin elders think that it is most likely on one of the levels of the main stack archives. But the folio can be any place at all, in one of the reading rooms, in a forgotten library cart, in a hall, in one of the matron's tables. So before we try to find a way into the archives, try to sense its voice here. Close your eyes, relax." Artyom squeezed his eyes shut and started to listen intently. In the complete darkness, the silence fell apart into dozens of tiny noises. The creaking of wooden shelves, the noise of drafts passing down corridors, vague murmurs, howls that carried from the street, and a noise like a geriatric cough that carried from the reading rooms. But Artyom was unable to hear anything that resembled a call or a voice. He stood like that, motionless, for 5 minutes, and then 5 more, ineffectively holding his breath, which might have obstructed his efforts to differentiate the voice of the living book from the farrago of dead book sounds. "No," he said, guiltily shaking his head and finally opening his eyes. "There's nothing." Melnick said nothing, nor did Daniel, but Artyom caught his disappointed look, which was self-explanatory. "Maybe it's really not here. So, we'll go to the stack archives. Or more precisely, we'll try to get there." After a minute, the stalker made up his mind and signaled the others to follow him. He stepped forward through the wide doorway where only one of the 2 original door panels remained on its hinges. It was charred along its edges and covered with strange characters. There was a small round room on the other side with a 6-meter-high ceiling and 4 entrances. 10 followed Melnick and Daniel, taking advantage of the fact that they could not see him, took a step to the nearest surviving cabinet, pulled out one of the drawers, and took a card out of it. Running his eyes over the card, his face took on a puzzled look, and he shoved the card into his breast pocket. Understanding that Artyom had seen everything, he pressed a finger to his lips in a conspiratorial manner and hurried after the stalkers. The walls of the round room were also covered with drawings and signs, and a sofa with broken springs and upholstered in cut-up imitation leather stood in a corner. In one of the 4 passages, an overturned bookstand lay near some spilled pamphlets. "Don't touch anything," warned Melnick. 10 sat down on the sofa, causing the springs to squeak. Daniel followed his example. Artyom, as if under a spell, stared hard at the scattered books on the floor. "They're untouched," he mumbled. "We have to put out rat poison at our station's library, or the rats would eat everything." "So what? There are no rats here?" he asked, again recalling what Bourbon had said, about how the time to worry wasn't when a place was crawling with rats, but when there weren't any rats around at all. "What rats? Are you kidding?" Melnick made a discontented face. "Where are you going to find rats around here? They ate them all a long time ago." "Who?" asked a puzzled Artyom. "What do you mean, who?" "The librarians, of course," explained 10. "So are they animals or people?" asked Artyom. "Not animals, that's for sure," said the stalker, shaking his head pensively, and said nothing else. A massive wooden door, located far down one of the passages, gave a long creak. Both stalkers immediately darted in different directions, taking cover behind the embedded columns at both ends of the arch. Daniel slipped from the sofa to the floor and rolled to the side. Artyom followed his example. "Up further is the main reading room," whispered the Brahmin to Artyom. "They show up there once in a while." "Oh, cut the chatter," interrupted Melnick fiercely. "Don't you know that librarians can't stand noise? For them, noise is like waving a red rag in front of a bull." He swore and indicated the door to the reading room to 10. 10 nodded. Staying close to the walls, they began to slowly move towards the huge oak door panels. Neither Artyom nor Daniel was less than a step behind. Melnick was the first to go in. Leaning with his back against one of the door panels and raising his rifle so that the barrel pointed up,
He took a deep breath, let it out, and then sharply pushed the panel open with his shoulder, simultaneously pointing the barrel at the opened black mouth of the main hall. They were all there in an instant. The hall was a room of incredible size, with a ceiling that disappeared 20 meters above the floor. Just as in the vestibule, heavy, thick vines with flowers hung from the ceiling. The walls of the hall were covered in the same unnatural morning glories. On each side of them there were 6 giant windows, where a part of the glazing remained unbroken. However, the illumination was very weak. Light from the moon barely penetrated a dense tangle of fat, gleaming stalks. Earlier, rows of tables had been arranged to the left and right to accommodate readers. Much of that furniture had been hauled off, and some had been burned or broken, but about a dozen tables remained untouched. These stood closer to a decorated cracked panel at the opposite wall, in whose exact center rose a sculpture that was indistinct in the semi-darkness. Plastic signs reading, "Observe Silence," were screwed onto surfaces everywhere. The silence here was completely different from that of the vestibule. Here it was so thick you could almost touch it. It seemed to entirely fill this ancient rough hall, and you felt afraid to disturb it. They stood there, searching the space in front of them with their flashlights, until Melnick concluded, "Probably the wind." But at that very instant, Artyom noticed a gray shadow that crossed in front of them, between 2 broken tables, which disappeared into a black gap in the bookshelves. Melnick saw it too. Placing his night vision device to his eyes, he jerked his rifle up and, stepping carefully over the moss-overgrown floor, started to approach the mysterious access. 10 moved after him. Even though Artyom and Daniel had been motioned to remain where they were, they couldn't stand it and also followed the stalkers. Remaining at the entrance alone was too spooky. At the same time, Artyom could not resist looking around with delight at the hall, which retained vestiges of its former grandeur. This not only saved his own life, but everyone else's too. Galleries encircled the entire perimeter of the room at a height of several meters. These were rather narrow walkways enclosed by wooden railings. You could look through the windows from the galleries, and furthermore, there were doors leading to office spaces both in the wall they were standing next to and in the walls on both sides of the ancient panel. The gallery was accessible via twin stairs that were located on both sides of the reading sculpture, or via an identical set of stairs that ascended from the entrance. And it was down those stairs that humped, gray figures now descended, deliberately and silently. There were more than a dozen of them, creatures that did not quite melt into the gloom. They would have been about Artyom's height if they hadn't been bent over double so that their long forelegs, which amazingly resembled arms, all but touched the floor. The creatures moved on their hind legs, taking waddling steps, yet with surprising nimbleness and silence. From a distance, they most closely resembled gorillas, pictures of which Artyom had seen in his childhood in a biology book his stepfather had tried to teach from. Artyom had no more than a second for all these observations because, as soon as his flashlight beam fell on one of the humped figures casting a sharp black shadow on the wall behind it, a diabolical churring sound rang out all around them, and the creatures, no longer attempting stealth, rushed down. "Librarians!" yelled Daniel with all his strength. "Down!" ordered Melnick. Artyom and Daniel threw themselves to the floor. They chose not to fire, recalling the stalker's warning that shots or any loud noises would attract and aggravate librarians. Their hesitation was dispelled by Melnick, who threw himself to the floor next to them and was the first to open fire. Several creatures fell down with a roar. Others threw themselves headlong into the darkness, but only in order to steal closer. After several instants, one of the monsters suddenly appeared 2 meters from them and made a long jump, attempting to seize 10 by the throat. Falling onto the floor, 10 managed to cut the creature down with a short burst. "Run! Get back to the round room and try to get to the archives. The Brahmin should know how to get there. They teach them that. We'll stay here, cover you, and try to fight them off," said Melnick to Artyom, and without a further word, crawled off to join his partner. Artyom motioned to Daniel, and both bolted for the exit, staying low to the ground.
One of the librarians sprang from the darkness to meet them, but it was swept away in a hail of lead. The stalkers were keeping an eye on the pair. Exiting the main reading room, Daniel darted back to the vestibule from where they had come. For an instant, Artyom thought that his partner had been frightened by the librarian so much that he was trying to run away. But Daniel wasn't running for the stairs that led to the exit. Going around them, he ran past the surviving card catalog cabinets to the opposite end of the vestibule. There, the room narrowed and ended in 3 pairs of doors, in front and on both sides. The right-hand doors led to a staircase where absolute darkness prevailed. Here, the Brahmin finally stopped to catch his breath. It took Artyom a few seconds to catch up, as he had never expected such agility from his companion. Standing still, they listened. They heard gunfire and cries from the main hall, so the fight was continuing. It wasn't clear who would get the upper hand in the battle, and they couldn't waste time waiting to see who won. "Why are we going back? Why did we start out going the other way?" asked Artyom, catching his breath. "I don't know where they were taking us." Daniel shrugged. "Maybe they intended to take us some other way. The elders taught us only one way, and it leads to the archives exactly from this side of the vestibule. Now we go up the stairs 1 floor, then along the corridor to another set of stairs, then through the duplicate card catalog, and then we'll be in the archives." He pointed his rifle into the darkness and stepped into the stairwell. Artyom followed, lighting the way with his beam. There was an elevator shaft in the middle of the stairs. It went down about 3 floors and went up about the same distance. Apparently, the shaft had once been glassed in, as in places sharp glass shards, now frosted with decades of dust, could still be seen poking out of the cast iron structure. The square well of the shaft was girdled by rotted wooden stair steps that were strewn with broken glass, spent brass cartridges, and dried piles of excrement. There was no trace of railings, and Artyom had to press himself against the wall and carefully watch where he stepped so as not to slip and fall into the opening. They went up 1 floor and found themselves in a small square room. There were 3 outlets from here, too, and Artyom realized that without his guide, it was unlikely he'd find his way out of this labyrinth. The left-hand door led to a wide, dark corridor whose end he could not see by the light of his flashlight. The right-hand door was closed and had been boarded up in crisscross fashion for some reason. On the adjacent wall was written in soot, "Do not open! Deadly danger!" Daniel led Artyom straight ahead, down a passage that ran at an angle to another corridor that was narrower and full of new doors. The Brahmin did not move so quickly down this corridor and stopped often to listen. The floor here was of inlaid parquet and forbidding signs reading, "Observe silence!" Hung on the walls, which were painted yellow, as were the walls throughout the library. Rooms and trashed offices could be seen behind doors that were wide open. Rustling could sometimes be heard from behind closed doors, and once Artyom thought he heard steps. Judging from his partner's face, this spoke of nothing good, and both hurried to get out of there as quickly as possible. Then, as Daniel had expected, a doorway to another stairwell appeared on their right. It was lighter here compared to the murk of the halls, as there were windows at each flight of stairs. From the 5th floor, you could see the courtyard, some outbuildings, and the burned-out skeletons of some technical equipment. But Artyom was not able to examine the courtyard for long. As 2 gray, humped figures emerged from behind the corner of the building he and Daniel were in. They made their way slowly across the courtyard as if they were searching for something. Suddenly, one of the creatures stopped and raised its head, and Artyom felt as if it was looking directly at the window at which he was standing. Recoiling, Artyom squatted on his heels. He didn't have to explain what had happened to his partner, who grasped everything. "Librarians?" he whispered with alarm, also squatting so as not to be visible from the street. Artyom nodded silently. Daniel then wiped the plexiglass of his gas mask as if this would help him dry his forehead, which was perspiring from worry. He then collected his thoughts and hurried up the stairs, dragging Artyom behind him, 1 flight up, and then another set of winding corridors. Finally, the Brahmin stopped uncertainly in front of several doors. "I don't remember anything about this place," he said, perplexed. "There's supposed to be an entrance to the duplicate card catalog." but nobody told us there'd be several doorways. He pondered, then half-heartedly jerked the handle of one of the doors. It was locked. The other doors were locked too. Uncomprehendingly, as if he refused to believe it, Daniel shook his head and pulled the handles once more. Then Artyom tried as well, also without result. "They're locked," he said. There was despair in his voice. Suddenly Daniel gave a little shudder, and Artyom, looking at him in alarm, took a step away from his partner, just in case. But Daniel only laughed. "Why don't you knock?" he suggested to Artyom, and added with a sobbing laugh, "Sorry, it's probably a fit of hysterics." Artyom felt the incongruous laughter filling him too. The tension that had been building over the past hour was starting to show, and, try as they might to control themselves, their silly giggling broke through to the outside. For a minute, both stood with their backs to the wall and laughed. "Knock," repeated Artyom, holding his belly and regretting not being able to take off his gas mask to wipe away his tears. He stepped up to the closest door and knocked on it 3 times with his knuckles. After a second, 3 resounding knocks came in response from the other side of the door. Artyom's throat dried immediately, and his heart started pounding frantically in his chest. Someone was standing behind the door, listening to their laughter and biding their time. "What the—" Daniel threw him a look that was mad with fear and backed away from the door. And from the other side, someone knocked again, louder and more demandingly. And then Artyom did what Sukhoi had once taught him. Pushing off from the wall, he kicked the lock of the next door over. He hadn't counted on it working, but the door opened with a crash. The lock's steel mechanism had torn out of the rotten door, together with some wood. The room behind this door was unlike any of the other rooms or corridors of the library through which they had passed. For some reason, it was very humid and oppressive here, and by the light from their flashlights, they could see a small hall that was densely overgrown with strange plants. Thick stalks, heavy, oily leaves, a mixture of scents so intense it even penetrated their gas mask filters. A floor covered with tangled roots and trunks, thorns, flowers. The roots of some of them disappeared into preserved or shattered flower pots or tubs. The now familiar vines entwined and supported rows of wooden cabinets that were identical in appearance to those in the big vestibule, but rotted through entirely owing to the high humidity. This became clear as soon as Daniel tried to open one of the drawers. "It's the duplicate card catalog," he told Artyom with a sigh of relief. "We're not far now." They heard another knock on the door behind them, and then someone carefully tried the doorknob as if testing it. Moving the vines aside with their rifles and trying not to trip over the roots that ran along the floor, they hurried to pass through the ominous secret garden hidden in the depths of the library. There was another door at the other end of the hall, and this one was not locked. They passed down the last corridor and finally stopped. They were in the Stack Archive. They felt it immediately. There was book dust in the air. The library was breathing calmly, and the murmur of billions of pages could be heard ever so slightly. Artyom looked around, and it seemed to him he could smell the odor of old books, a favorite of his childhood. He looked at Daniel inquiringly. "That's it. We're here," confirmed Daniel, then added in a hopeful tone, Well, it's spooky," admitted Artyom, not understanding immediately what his partner was expecting. "Do you hear the book?" clarified the Brahmin. "From here, its voice should be more distinct." Artyom closed his eyes and tried to concentrate. The inside of his head was empty and reverberated, as if inside an abandoned tunnel. Standing like that for a while, he again began to hear the little noises that filled the library building, but he wasn't able to hear anything resembling a voice or a call. Worse, he felt nothing. And even if one assumed that the voice Daniel and the other Brahmins spoke of was some completely different type of sensation, that changed nothing. "No, I don't hear anything." He spread his hands. "Never mind," sighed Daniel after a silence. "Let's go to another level. There are 19 of them here. We'll keep looking until we find it. We better not go back with empty hands." Going out onto the service staircase, they went up several floors of concrete steps before stopping to again try their luck. At this level, everything looked like the place they came to initially. A medium-sized room with glazed windows, several office tables, the now familiar growth on the ceiling and in the corners, and 2 corridors, going off in different directions, filled with endless rows of bookshelves along both sides of a narrow passageway. The ceiling in both the room and the corridors was low, just over 2 meters in height, and after the incredible vastness of the vestibule and the main reading room, it seemed that not only would it be difficult to squeeze between the floor and ceiling here, but to breathe as well. The stacks were densely packed with thousands of various books, and many of them appeared to be completely untouched and marvelously preserved, evidence that the library was built so that even when people abandoned it, a special microclimate was preserved inside. Seeing such fabulous wealth even made Artyom forget for a minute why he was there, and he dived into one of the rows, looking at the spines and running his hand over them reverently. Concluding that his partner had heard what he had been sent here for, Daniel initially didn't interfere, but then finally realized what was going on. He grabbed Artyom rather roughly and pulled him further on. There were 3, 4, 6 corridors, 102 of stacks, thousands and even more thousands of books, revealed in the impenetrable darkness of the stack archive by a yellow spot of light. The next level, and the next. All for nothing. Artyom felt nothing that could be said to be a voice or a call. Absolutely nothing unusual. He recalled that if the Brahmins at the meeting of Polis Council considered him to be the chosen one, endowed with a special gift and led by fate, then the military had its own explanation for his visions. Hallucinations. He had begun to feel something on the last few floors, but it wasn't what he had expected or wanted. It was the vague feeling of someone's presence that reminded him of the notorious fear of the tunnels. Although all of the levels they had visited seemed completely abandoned, and there were no signs here of librarians or other creatures, he nevertheless kept wanting to turn around, and he had this crazy feeling that someone was attentively observing them through the bookshelves. Daniel tapped him on the shoulder and directed the flashlight at his boot. A long lace, which the Brahmin wasn't too good at tying, dragged behind him on the floor. "While I tie this, you go on ahead and take a look. Maybe you'll hear something after all," he whispered, and squatted down. Artyom nodded and proceeded to move ahead slowly, step by step, looking back at Daniel every second. Daniel was having a difficult time. It wasn't easy to tie a slippery lace while wearing thick gloves. Moving forward, Artyom first shone a light down the endless row of shelves to his right, then sharply threw his beam to the left, trying to catch sight of crooked gray shadows of librarians in the rows of dusty and age-warped books. Having moved about 30 meters ahead of his partner, Artyom suddenly distinctly heard a rustling 2 rows ahead of him. His rifle was already at hand, so he pressed his flashlight against the barrel, and with one bound was at the corridor where he reckoned someone was hiding. He saw 2 rows of shelves, crammed to the top with volumes, receding into the distance. Emptiness. The beam darted to the left. Maybe the enemy was hiding there in the opposite direction. Emptiness. Artyom held his breath, attempting to attentively distinguish the slightest noise. There was nothing, only the illusory murmuring of pages. He returned to the passageway and threw his beam to where Daniel was struggling with his bootlace. It was empty. Empty? Not looking where he was going, Artyom rushed back. The spot of light from his flashlight jumped frantically from side to side, illuminating row after row of identical shelves in the darkness. Where had he stopped? 30 meters. About 30 meters, he should be here. But there's nobody. Where could he have gone without first telling Artyom? If he had been attacked, why hadn't he resisted? What happened? What could have happened to him? No, he had already gone back too far. Daniel should have been a lot closer. But he wasn't anywhere. Artyom felt he was losing control of his actions and that he was starting to panic. Stopping at the same place where he had left Daniel to tie his bootlace, Artyom leaned his back limply against the end of a shelf. Suddenly, from the depths of the bookshelf row, he heard a quiet, inhuman voice that broke off into an eerie squawk. "Artyom!" Suffocating from fear and almost unable to see anything through his fogged gas mask, Artyom turned abruptly towards the voice and, attempting to keep the corridor in his rifle's unsteady sights, he moved forward. "Artyom!" The voice was just around the corner. Suddenly, a thin fan of light cut through a shelf, leaking between some loosely shelved books at floor level. The beams moved back and forth as if someone was repeatedly waving a flashlight left and right. Artyom heard the jangling of metal. Artyom! It was barely discernible, but this time it was a familiar whisper, and there was no doubt the voice belonged to Daniel. Artyom cheerfully took a broad step forward, hoping to see his partner, whereupon the same eerie, guttural squawk he had heard initially split the air not more than 2 paces away. The flashlight beam continued to pointlessly rove over the floor back and forth. Artyom! The strange voice repeated the call. Artyom took another step, glanced to the right, and felt the hair on his head stand on end. The row of shelves ended here, forming a niche, and Daniel sat on its floor in a pool of blood. His helmet and gas mask had been torn off and were lying on the floor some distance away. Though his face was as pale as that of a corpse, his open eyes were conscious, and his lips attempted to form words. Behind him, half merged into the gloom, there hid a humped, gray figure. A long, bony hand, covered with bristly silver fur, and not a paw, but a real hand with powerful, incurved claws, was pensively rolling the flashlight that had dropped to the floor and now lay a half-meter from Daniel. The other hand was buried in the ripped-open belly of the Brahmin. "You're here," whispered Daniel. "You're here," rasped the voice behind Daniel's back, with exactly the same intonation. "A librarian. Behind me. I'm dead anyway." "Shoot, kill him," Daniel said in a weakening voice. "Shoot, kill him," repeated the shadow. The flashlight once again deliberately rolled on the floor to the left, only to return to its starting point to repeat the cycle yet again. Artyom felt he was losing his mind. Melnick's words about how the sound of gunshots could attract the nightmarish monsters churned in his head. "Go away," he said to the librarian, not expecting, however, that he would be understood. "Go away," came the almost affectionate reply, but the clawed hand continued to search for something in Daniel's stomach, causing Daniel to groan quietly, while a drop of blood drew a thick line from the corner of his mouth to his chin. "Shoot!" said Daniel louder, having gathered some strength. "Shoot!" demanded the librarian from behind his back. Should he shoot his new friend himself, and in doing so attract other creatures? Or should he leave Daniel to die here and run while there was still time? By now, it was doubtful Daniel could be saved. With his ripped-open belly and eviscerated entrails, the Brahmin had less than an hour left. A pointed gray ear appeared from behind Daniel's tipped-back head, followed by a huge green eye that sparkled in the flashlight's beam. The librarian slowly looked out from behind his dying partner, almost shyly, and his eyes sought Artyom's. "Don't turn away. Look right there, right at him, right in his pupils." The pupils were vertical, those of an animal. And how strange it was to see vestiges of intelligence in these sinister, impossible eyes. Now, up close, the librarian in no way resembled a gorilla or even a monkey. His predatory face was overgrown with fur. The mouth was full of long fangs and reached almost from ear to ear, while the eyes were of such a size that they made the monster unlike any animal Artyom had ever seen, either in real life or in pictures. It seemed to him that this went on for a very long time. Having plunged into the creature's gaze, he could no longer tear himself away from those pupils. Only when Daniel emitted a deep, lingering groan did Artyom snap out of it. He placed the tiny red dot of his sight directly on the unkempt gray fur of the librarian's low forehead and thumbed the selector of his rifle to semi-automatic fire. Upon hearing the soft, metallic click, the monster spluttered angrily and again hid behind Daniel's back. "Go away," it said suddenly from behind Artyom's back, mimicking Artyom's intonation perfectly. Artyom woozily stopped in his tracks. This time the librarian hadn't just echoed his words, it was as if he had remembered them and understood their meaning. Could this be? "Artyom, while I can still speak." Daniel started to speak, having gathered his strength and attempting to focus his gaze, which grew cloudier with every minute. "In my breast pocket, an envelope. I was told to give it to you if you found the book. But I didn't find anything." Artyom shook his head. "Didn't find anything," echoed the eerie voice behind Daniel's back. "It doesn't matter. I know why you agreed to do this. It wasn't for you. Maybe it'll help you. It doesn't matter to me if I obeyed the order or not. Just remember this, you can't go back to Polis. If they find out you came up empty-handed, And if the military finds out, go through other stations. Now shoot, because it really hurts. I don't want... hurts. Mixing the words, the librarian repeated, hissing, and his arm made a sudden movement in Daniel's ripped stomach, which caused the latter to jerk convulsively and cry out with all his might. Artyom could not take any more. Throwing caution to the wind, he thumbed his rifle back to automatic and, pursing his lips, pulled the trigger, stitching bullets into his partner and the beast that hid behind his body. The unexpectedly loud noise tore the silence of the library into ribbons. Shrill churring sounds followed, stopping suddenly, all at the same time. The dusty books absorbed their echo like a sponge. When Artyom next opened his eyes, it was finished. Approaching the librarian, which had dropped its bullet-riddled head onto the shoulder of its victim, and even in death still hid shyly behind him, Artyom lit up the eerie picture and felt his blood cooling in his veins, while his palms perspired from tension. Then he fastidiously poked the librarian with the toe of his boot, and its body fell back heavily. It was dead, there could be no doubt. Trying not to look at the bloody mess that had been Daniel's face, Artyom started to slowly undo the zipper of the dead man's protective suit. The clothing had quickly become soaked in thick black blood, and a transparent vapor rose from it into the cool air of the Stack Archive. Artyom started to feel nauseated. The breast pocket. The fingers inside his protective gloves awkwardly tried to undo the button, and it occurred to him that such gloves might have delayed Daniel for the minute that cost him his life. A rustling could distinctly be heard in the distance, followed by the patter of barefoot steps along the corridor. Artyom twisted around nervously and ran the flashlight beam over the passageways. Having assured himself that he was alone for the moment, he continued to struggle with the button. The button finally yielded, and his stiff fingers managed to remove a thin gray envelope from deep inside the pocket. The envelope was inside a polyethylene bag that had a bullet hole in it. In addition, Artyom found a blood-stained pasteboard rectangle in the pocket, undoubtedly the card Daniel had taken out of the card catalog drawer in the vestibule. The card read, Shnurkov N.E. Irrigation and the Prospects for Agriculture in the Tajik SSR, Dushanbe, 1965. Pattering and indistinct muttering could now be heard a very short distance away. There was no time left. Collecting Daniel's rifle and flashlight, which had fallen out of the librarian's claws, Artyom took off and ran back the way he came as fast as he could, almost not seeing where he was going, past the endless rows of bookshelves. He didn't know for sure if he was being followed, as the noise of his boots and the pounding of blood in his ears prevented him from hearing any sounds behind him. As soon as he jumped into the stairwell and began to tumble down the concrete steps, he realized that he didn't even know on what floor the entrance they had used to enter the archives was located. He could, of course, go down to the first floor, knock out the stairwell glass, and jump out into the courtyard. He stopped for a second and looked outside. Exactly in the center of the courtyard, with their faces pointed up, several gray creatures stood motionless, looking at the windows, and, it seemed, directly at him. Petrified, Artyom pressed himself against a side wall and resumed his descent, treading softly. Now that he had stopped tramping his boots down the stairs, he could hear the patter of bare feet, which got louder and louder. Then, having completely lost control of himself, he resumed a headlong rush down the stairs, jumping out at the next level so as to fitfully look around in search of a familiar door, not finding it and then flinging himself onward, stopping and squeezing into dark corners when it seemed he could hear steps nearby, desperately looking around in dead-end passages and crawlways, and again entering the stairs to go down one more floor or go up 2 more levels. Perhaps he overlooked something? Understanding that the infernal noise with which he was desperately trying to find an exit from this labyrinth would attract every monstrous inhabitant of the library, but unable to calm himself down, Artyom pointlessly and unsuccessfully tried to find the exit. That is, until he made out a familiar half-bent silhouette against the background of a knocked-out window as he was about to enter the stairwell again. Artyom moved back, dived into the first passage that presented itself, pressed his back to the wall, pointed his rifle at the opening from where he reckoned the librarian had to appear, and held his breath. Silence. The brute either decided not to pursue Artyom alone or was waiting for Artyom to blunder and come out of hiding. He didn't have to go back the same way, though. The passage led onward. Thinking hard for a second, Artyom began to step backward from the opening, keeping his sight trained on it. The corridor turned to the side, but at that very place the turn began, there was a black hole in the wall. The area was strewn with shards of brick and sprinkled with lime. Obeying an impulse, Artyom stepped through the hole into a room full of broken furniture. Pieces of photographic and movie film were scattered over the floor. A slightly open door could be seen ahead, from behind which a narrow wedge of pale moonlight fell onto the floor. Stepping carefully on the treacherously creaky parquet, Artyom reached the door and looked out. He recognized the room, although now he was at its opposite end. The imposing statue of the person reading, the incredible height of the ceiling and the gigantic windows, the path which led to the grotesque wooden portal of the exit, as well as the disturbed rows of reading tables along the sides. Without a doubt, he was in the main reading room. He stood on the enclosed wooden balustrade of the narrow gallery that girdled the hall at a height of 4 meters. It was from this gallery that the librarians came down at them. He had no idea how he had managed to get here from the Stack archives, not to mention from the other side, bypassing the route he and Daniel had traveled to get there. But there was no time to reflect. The librarians could be hard on his heels. Artyom ran down one of the 2 symmetrical stairs that led to the pedestal of the monument and sprang to the doors. Not far from the carved wooden arch of the exit, several deformed bodies of librarians lay spread-eagled on the floor, and as he passed by where the battle had taken place, Artyom almost fell after losing his footing in a pool of thickening blood. The heavy door was opened unwillingly, and a bright white light blinded him at once. Recalling Melnik's instructions, Artyom gripped his flashlight in his right hand and hastily described a triple circle, giving the sign that he was approaching with peaceful intentions. The dazzling beam immediately went to the side, and Artyom, having thrown his machine gun behind his back, slowly moved forward into a round room with columns and a couch, still not knowing who was coming to meet him. A light machine gun stood on its tripod on the floor, and Melnik was leaning over his partner. Ten was reclining with his eyes closed on the couch, making short moaning sounds from time to time. His right leg was twisted unnaturally, and having seen him, Artyom understood that it was broken at the knee and bent, not forward, but backward. He could not imagine how such a thing might occur, and what strength the one who had been able to so mutilate the stalwart tracker must have possessed. "Where's your comrade?" Melnik tossed the question at Artyom, turning away from Ten for a second. "The librarians, in the depository. They attacked," Artyom tried to explain. For some reason he didn't want to say that he had killed Daniel himself out of mercy. "Did you find the book?" the tracker asked, just as abruptly. "No," Artyom shook his head. "I didn't hear anything there, and I didn't feel anything. Give me a hand lifting him up." "No, better take his rucksack, and mine, too. See what his leg looks like. They nearly tore it off. Now he can only be carried piggyback." Melnik nodded at Ten. Artyom gathered all the equipment, 3 rucksacks, 2 machine guns, and the light machine gun, about 30 kilos of weight in all, and it wasn't easy lifting it. It was even more difficult for Melnik, shouldering the limp body of his partner with some difficulty, and even the short trip down the staircase, toward the exit, took them several long minutes. They could no longer see any librarians all the way to the doors, but when Artyom flung open the heavy wooden doors, letting through the groaning tracker, a squawking howl was heard from the darkest bowels of the building, full of hatred and anguish. Artyom felt shivers running through him again, and he hurried to shut the door. Now the main thing was to reach the metro as soon as possible. "Lower your eyes," Melnik ordered when they were on the street. "The star will be right in front of you now. Don't even think of looking over the roofs." Barely moving his stiffening legs, Artyom obediently stared at the ground, dreaming only of overcoming those inconceivably sprawling 200 meters from the library to the descent to Borovitskaya. However, the tracker wouldn't allow Artyom to enter the metro. "It's impossible to go to the police now. You don't have the book, and you lost their guide," Melnik pronounced, gently lowering his wounded comrade to the ground and breathing heavily. "The Brahmins would hardly like it. And mainly this means that you are not the chosen one, and they have entrusted their secrets to you. You'd disappear without a trace if you return to the police. They have specialists there, regardless whether they are intelligent or not. And even I won't be able to protect you. Now you have to leave. It's best you go to Smolenskaya. Go straight through. There are few houses, and there's no need to go deep into any alleys. Maybe you'll get there, if you hurry before sunrise." "What sunrise?" Artyom asked, puzzled. The news that he would have to reach the other metro station on the surface alone, to which, judging by the map, was about 2 kilometers away, was for him like a kick in the head. The sun. People are night animals, and it's better for them if they don't show themselves on the surface by day. But there are those who crawl out of the ruins to warm themselves in the sun, and you'll regret it 100 times over if you interrupt them. And I'm not just talking about the light. You'll go blind in 2 seconds flat, and the dark glasses won't save you. "But why am I going alone?" Artyom asked, still not believing his ears. "Never fear. You'll be walking straight ahead the whole way. You'll exit onto Kalininsky and continue along it. There aren't any turns. Don't show yourself on the way, but stay really close to the houses. They live everywhere there. Go on until you reach the intersection with a second broad avenue. This will be Sadovoye Koltso. There you turn left and straight ahead to a white stone apartment building. It was once the House of Fashion. You'll find it right away, right opposite. Across Sadovoye stands a half-ruined, very tall building, the Trade Center. There will be sort of a yellow arch behind the House of Fashion on which Metro Station Smolenskaya is written. Turn into it, you'll come to a small square, a sort of inside courtyard, and you'll see the station itself there. If everything is quiet, try to get below. One entrance is closed there and guarded. They keep it for their own trackers. Knock on the gate like this. 3 fast raps, 2 slow, then 3 fast. They should open it. Tell them that Melnick sent you and wait for me there. I'm taking 10 to the infirmary and will leave right away. I'll be there before noon. I'll find you myself. Take the machine guns with you. We don't know how it all will turn out. But there's another station, closer, on the map. You know. Arbatskaya. Artyom had recalled the name. There is such a station, but you don't have to go near it. And you don't even want to. You'll pass right by it. Stay on the other side of the street and move quickly. But don't run. That's it. Don't waste any time, he concluded, and he nudged Artyom towards the exit from the vestibule. Artyom didn't want to argue anymore. Having thrown one of the machine guns over his shoulder, he held the second at the ready, went into the street and hurried back toward the monument, covering his eyes with his right hand so as not to see the beckoning radiance of the Kremlin stars by accident.